Hello and welcome to Game of Box Office. Today we will take a look at the box office run of The Dark Knight Rises. Let's start off with some statistics. The Dark Knight Rises was released on July 20th, 2012 in 4,404 cinemas and ran a total of 147 days until the last performance on December 13th, 2012. The film was produced by Warner Bros. With a budget of $250 million and received an PG-13 rating. The film opened to $160.9 million and finished its run at $448.1 million in the USA and Canada. In addition, The Dark Knight Rises made $636.8 million in the rest of the world, resulting in a combined total of $1.08 billion worldwide. The Dark Knight Rises is a huge financial success. Let's get that straight right away. The third installment of the Dark Knight trilogy had an enormous hype. The final film of Christopher Nolan had the huge hype of the predecessor, The Dark Knight, because of Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker and the on-point directing of Christopher Nolan on a masterclass level. The Dark Knight quickly received the title of one of the best movies in history, and the box office run of The Dark Knight is also historical. We mentioned all of that in our analysis on The Dark Knight that you can watch here. Sadly for The Dark Knight Rises, it was released 4 years after The Dark Knight, and as we already mentioned in our analysis on Star Trek Into Darkness, a gap of 4 years between a film and its sequel is always a very bad thing box office wise, because movies tend to perform not as good as the predecessor after a break of 4 years. Also, The Dark Knight Rises was 2.5 months after the momentous box office monster The Avengers, and audiences were kind of tired of comic book movies at that moment. Reviews were coming in, and just like with Star Trek Into Darkness, the reactions were very good with critics as well as the audiences, but not as good as with The Dark Knight. The movie opened to roughly $161 million, which is slightly better than The Dark Knight. By taking 4 years of ticket price inflation into account, The Dark Knight Rises opened worse than The Dark Knight. Of course, the shooting, which took place on one of the early screenings of The Dark Knight Rises, infected the audience and a few people didn't show up, but we think that even when the shooting did not happen, The Dark Knight Rises would have opened worse than The Dark Knight, when everything is adjusted. The much bigger overseas numbers of The Dark Knight Rises were created because of the hugely grown overseas market and because comic book movies also became a very liked overseas genre. The Dark Knight's $469.7 million from overseas are basically on the same level as The Dark Knight Rises overseas numbers with $636.8 million. The drop of $85.2 million in the USA and Canada is very hard for The Dark Knight Rises and shows very clearly that the movie was not able to get the same hype out of its quality. The multiplier of 2.79 is pretty good for such an enormous opening, but it's way behind The Dark Knight's 3.37. The drop rates from weekend to weekend were quite good, and the movie only had one weekend where the numbers were dropping more than 50%. So what can we say in conclusion about The Dark Knight Rises? The movie did not manage to gross equal achievements like The Dark Knight. Of course, is the worldwide total as well as the opening weekend and the domestic total enormous. But when you consider the factor that Christopher Nolan gained enormous fame because of The Dark Knight and Inception, which was also before The Dark Knight Rises, every of these achievements is kind of not so great. When you adjust The Dark Knight for ticket price inflation and give the movie the same cinema count as The Dark Knight Rises, it is easy to see how the sequel failed in comparison. Overall, the Game of Box Office team rates The Dark Knight Rises with the grade B. Our upcoming video will be an analysis about Gravity, Watchmen, or a prediction about Warcraft: The Beginning. We hope you enjoyed this analysis. Be sure to hit a like and subscribe to our channel. You can also support us on the social networks listed below. See you soon, bye bye.